It was a warm evening, just after sunset, as the streets of the small city began to quiet down. The lights of the nearby shops flickered as most people had already headed home from their long workdays. The moon, barely visible behind the clouds, cast a pale glow on the road as a black luxury car drove down the nearly empty street. Inside the car sat a woman, calm and composed. She was well dressed, her black suit sharply contrasting with her soft features. Her name was Alicia Matthews, and while she looked like just another successful businesswoman, she was far more than that. Alicia wasn't just anyone. She was the director of the FBI, a woman known for her sharp mind, tough decisions, and powerful presence. Few people outside her inner circle knew that, though, and that was exactly how she liked it. After all, her job demanded secrecy. She was the face of national security, the one who made the tough calls, and the one who ensured that justice prevailed. As she approached an intersection, the blue and red lights of a police car flashed in her rear-view mirror, breaking the peaceful quiet of the night. The siren sounded off, sharp and insistent. Alicia didn't panic. She had been stopped before, often by officers who didn't recognize her and assumed she was just another wealthy driver, assuming they could flex their power over her. She checked her mirrors, pulling over to the side of the road with a smooth motion. Her hand gripped the wheel for just a moment longer than usual, as she braced herself for another interaction with law enforcement. The officer's footsteps echoed loudly in the night as he approached the car. Alicia rolled down her window, her gaze steady and calm. The officer, a tall man with a rugged face and the look of someone who had seen more than his fair share of trouble, leaned in with a stern expression. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice harsh. He didn't smile, nor did he give any sign that he was approaching this interaction with any sense of politeness. Alicia could feel his eyes scanning her, sizing her up, but she didn't let her discomfort show. "Of course," Alicia replied, her voice steady and measured. She reached for her purse, pulling out her ID and the vehicle's registration. It was a routine stop, one she had experienced many times in her life. But this officer wasn't like the others. There was something in his posture, his tone, something that made Alicia feel uneasy. As she handed him the documents, the officer didn't immediately check them. Instead, as the media frenzy continued, the legal process was beginning to take shape. Officer Stevens was placed on administrative leave, but the deeper question was what would happen next. Alicia knew that the next steps. While the courtroom was filled with tension as the final days of the trial drew near. It had been a long, exhausting process, and everyone involved knew that this case would be remembered for years to come. Alicia had seen the pressures of high-stakes investigations before, but this felt different. This was personal, not just for her, but for the countless others who had been affected by similar incidents of injustice. It wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about what they represented. It was about the larger fight for fairness, for accountability, for change. The case against Officer Stevens had been a battle from the start. His defense team had pulled out all the stops, trying to discredit the evidence, questioning Alicia's credibility, and even suggesting that her position as the FBI director made her biased. They had tried to make it seem as if Stevens had been forced to act out of fear and that his behavior was a result of a split-second decision made under pressure. But the evidence spoke for itself. The body cam footage was clear, the witness statements were consistent, and the officer's history of aggressive behavior was undeniable. There was no excuse for what he had done, and Alicia knew that the truth was on her side. As the final arguments were made in the courtroom, Alicia couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led up to this moment. She thought back to the night of the incident, the way she had tried to remain calm and composed in the face of an officer who had clearly underestimated her. She had known that her response to the situation would set the tone for everything that followed. It was a defining moment for her, a moment when she had to stand firm and make sure that justice was served not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. The prosecutor gave their closing statement, emphasizing the officer's failure to adhere to basic protocol, the excessive force used in a routine traffic stop, and the way Stevens had let his personal biases cloud his judgment. They painted a picture of an officer who had let his authority go to his head, who had treated a civilian with disrespect and aggression, simply because of who she was. The prosecutor reminded the jury that this wasn't just about one bad apple, it was about the system that allowed officers like Stevens to act with impunity, to treat people like Alicia as if they were less than human. When it was Alicia's turn to testify, she spoke with calm conviction. She recounted the events of that night, not just from her perspective, but in a way that framed the broader issue at hand. She talked about the importance of holding law enforcement officers accountable, not just for their actions, but for the trust that the public placed in them. She spoke about her years of service in the FBI, the dedication she had to her work, and how this incident had shaken her to her core. But more than anything, she emphasized the need for change, a need for reform, for accountability, and for justice. "I am not here because I was personally harmed," Alicia said in her closing statement. "I'm here because this is bigger than me. This is about a system that has failed too many people for too long. We have an obligation, all of us, to make sure that justice is not just a concept, but a reality. It is time for us to take responsibility for our actions, to hold those in power accountable, and to make sure that everyone, regardless of their background, their skin color, or their position in society, has the same access to justice. No one is above the law." Her words resonated in the courtroom, and even though she was speaking about her own experience, it was clear that she was speaking for something much larger. It was a message that people needed to hear, a message that transcended the specific case at hand. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult, no matter how much pressure there was. It was about making sure that the system worked for everyone. When the jury deliberated, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Alicia sat quietly, surrounded by her colleagues, each of them knowing that this moment would have far-reaching consequences. The trial had been an emotional roller coaster, and Alicia was exhausted. But she remained focused, knowing that the jury's decision would have a profound impact on the future of law enforcement. Hours passed as the jury deliberated, each moment feeling longer than the last. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the foreman stepped forward, holding the verdict in his hand. The judge called the courtroom to attention, and everyone fell silent. Alicia felt her heart race as she waited for the verdict to be read. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice steady but firm. The words hit the room like a shockwave. The tension in the air seemed to dissolve in an instant. Alicia felt a mix of relief, exhaustion, and even disbelief. The officer who had assaulted her, who had treated her with such disrespect, was being held accountable. It wasn't just about him, it was about the message that this decision sent. It was a victory, not just for Alicia, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice at the hands of law enforcement. Stevens was sentenced to prison time, and while some argued that the sentence wasn't long enough, it was a start. The case had brought attention to the issue of police brutality, and for the first time, it felt like real change was possible. The ruling sent a powerful message to law enforcement officers across the country: no one was above the law. In the weeks that followed, Alicia received messages of support from all corners of the country. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her for her bravery, for standing up when so many others had remained silent. Her story was shared on social media, not just as a tale of personal triumph, but as a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice. Alicia had become a beacon of hope for those who believed that change was possible, for those who had been silenced for too long. The aftermath of the trial was not without its challenges. There were those who continued to criticize Alicia, questioning her motives, accusing her of using the case to further her own career. But Alicia wasn't concerned with the naysayers. She had seen the power of change, and she knew that this was only the beginning. The case against Officer Stevens had brought to light a much larger issue, one that could no longer be ignored. It was a conversation that needed to continue, a conversation that would shape the future of law enforcement. Alicia had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had become part of something much bigger than herself. As she reflected on the journey, Alicia knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still much work to be done. But she had taken the first step, and that was all that mattered. Justice had been served, and that was a victory worth celebrating. LD determined not only the fate of one officer but also the broader message sent to law enforcement across the country. This wasn't just a case of police misconduct, this was a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for justice, fairness, and accountability. Alicia kept herself busy with her duties at the FBI, though the weight of the case was always in the back of her mind. The investigation into Officer Stevens was proceeding, but the pace felt slow. She knew that the public was waiting, and the pressure to act was mounting. As the days passed, Alicia received updates on the case, witness statements, evidence, and the results of body cam footage that had surfaced from the officer's patrol car. The footage was damning. It showed the officer's interactions with Alicia in full, his aggressive behavior, his disregard for protocol, and his decision to escalate the situation unnecessarily. It was clear to anyone who watched that Stevens had crossed a line, and there was no excuse for his actions. But legal proceedings were never as simple as black and white. The process had to be thorough, and the evidence had to be carefully reviewed. Alicia understood the importance of ensuring that the case was handled fairly. She had worked on enough high-stakes investigations to know that rushing to judgment could be dangerous, both for the accused and for the broader mission of justice. Meanwhile, Stevens' defense team was already working to discredit the claims. His lawyer, a seasoned attorney known for defending police officers in high-profile cases, began to build their case around the idea that Stevens had acted in self-defense. They argued that the officer had felt threatened when Alicia refused to comply with his commands, even though the video footage told a different story. The defense painted the officer as someone who had been trained to deal with potentially dangerous situations and that his actions, while forceful, had been made in the heat of the moment. The lawyer even hinted at the idea that Alicia's calm, composed demeanor during the confrontation was an attempt to manipulate the situation to her advantage. The defense strategy was clear: make Alicia seem like the one who had overreacted, who had forced the officer's hand. They questioned her response to the situation, asking why she hadn't simply complied when told to exit the vehicle. They tried to argue that the officer was merely doing his job, that the situation had escalated because of Alicia's own refusal to cooperate. The defense team was careful not to directly attack her character, but it was clear that they were trying to cast doubt on her version of events. Alicia was not surprised by these tactics. She had seen it before. The defense was always going to try to shift the blame, to deflect attention away from the real issue. But she had the truth on her side. The evidence was irrefutable, and she had no intention of backing down. She couldn't afford to. This case was bigger than her. It was bigger than one officer, one traffic stop. It was about the countless people who had been unfairly targeted, mistreated, or silenced by the system. It was about accountability. As the legal process unfolded, Alicia found herself facing increasing pressure not only from the public but from within the FBI as well. Some colleagues privately questioned her decision to pursue the case with such intensity. They wondered if the FBI's involvement in the case would be seen as biased, given her personal connection to the situation. There were whispers of concern that the investigation might damage the agency's reputation, especially if it didn't result in a clear-cut conviction. Alicia was no stranger to scrutiny. Throughout her career, she had faced challenges from all sides: internal politics, public expectations, and the constant battle to maintain a sense of impartiality. But this was different. This was personal. The officer's actions had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. She had seen the damage done by police brutality, had witnessed the way it tore communities apart. She knew that staying silent or backing down was not an option. In the days that followed, the case against Stevens began to take shape. The FBI's Internal Affairs Office worked tirelessly to collect evidence, and outside investigators were brought in to review the case from all angles. One of the key pieces of evidence was the body cam footage, which painted a clear picture of the officer's misconduct. It showed Stevens approaching Alicia's vehicle with hostility, demanding that she exit the car without any clear reason, and using force when she resisted. The video was critical in proving that Stevens had used excessive force in a situation that never warranted such a response. But the defense team wasn't going to give up easily. They continued to push the narrative that Stevens had been justified in his actions, citing his years of experience as a police officer and his training in handling dangerous situations. They questioned whether Alicia had truly been as calm and composed as she claimed. They even suggested that she had used her status as the FBI director to manipulate the situation in her favor. The defense tried to make it seem like Stevens was the real victim, that he had been forced to react the way he did because of Alicia's perceived disrespect. The courtroom battle was set to begin, and both sides were preparing for the fight of their lives. Alicia knew the case would be closely watched, not just by the public, but by law enforcement agencies across the country. This was an opportunity to set a precedent, to show that no one, no matter their position or status, was above the law. She knew that the outcome of this case could have far-reaching consequences for the way law enforcement interacted with the public. But it also had the potential to send a message to the many officers who believed that their badge gave them the right to treat others with contempt. As the trial date approached, Alicia found herself grappling with the personal toll of the case. She had always prided herself on her ability to separate her emotions from her work, but this was different. Every day, she was reminded of the assault, of the officer's disrespect, of the way he had tried to undermine her. It was hard to push aside the anger, the frustration, and the disappointment. But Alicia knew that now was not the time for personal feelings. She had to stay focused on the bigger picture. The legal battle was far from over, but Alicia remained determined. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal maneuvering, public scrutiny, and the constant challenge of keeping her personal emotions in check. But she was ready. She had faced challenges before, and she knew how to stand her ground. The trial would be her chance to ensure that justice was done not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been affected by police misconduct. After Alicia's initial report was filed, the storm began. It wasn't just about a police officer and a traffic stop anymore. It had grown into something much bigger. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and before long, Alicia's name was on the front pages of newspapers. The headline read, "FBI Director Targeted by Racist Cop During Routine Traffic Stop." It was a shocking and powerful headline, one that grabbed the attention of everyone from ordinary citizens to politicians. For Alicia, the media frenzy was both overwhelming and expected. She had been in the public eye before, but this was different. This wasn't just about national security or counterterrorism. This was about race, justice, and power. It was personal for so many people, and that made it even more volatile. The media had a field day, dissecting every aspect of the incident. They questioned the officer's actions, speculated about his history, and analyzed Alicia's response. Some were supportive, others critical. But there was one thing everyone agreed on: the officer's behavior was unacceptable, and it needed to be addressed. The media storm wasn't just a news cycle, it was a whirlwind of opinions, accusations, and debate. Some news outlets sided with Alicia, praising her for her calm demeanor during the confrontation and her quick decision to report the incident. They lauded her as a leader who was not afraid to stand up to abuse, no matter where it came from. They emphasized her position as the FBI director and how her courage could spark a larger conversation about race and law enforcement in America. But not everyone was so supportive. Some critics focused on the fact that Alicia was a high-profile figure. They questioned whether the incident would have been taken as seriously if she weren't in such a powerful position. Was she using her status to amplify this issue? Some pundits asked. They suggested that perhaps Alicia had exaggerated the situation in order to gain public sympathy or even to push a personal agenda. These voices often came from people who had been critical of the FBI in general, arguing that the agency was overstepping its bounds or abusing its power. They didn't like the idea of a government official using her position to challenge law enforcement, no matter the circumstances. But for Alicia, the criticisms didn't matter as much as the bigger picture. She knew that the conversation was about something much larger than one isolated incident. The underlying issue, the one that had been at the heart of her entire career, was about systemic problems within law enforcement. It was about racism, power, and the way some officers treated citizens based on assumptions and biases. The problem wasn't limited to one officer, it was a problem that ran deep in the country's institutions. As the media circus raged on, the FBI made a statement. The acting director held a press conference, reaffirming the agency's commitment to an independent and thorough investigation into Officer Stevens. He assured the public that justice would be served, regardless of the officer's position or tenure with the department. "We will not tolerate any form of abuse of power," the acting director said, his voice calm but firm. "This case is being taken seriously, and the full weight of the law will be applied to ensure accountability. The FBI is committed to fairness and justice, and that is the guiding principle in this investigation." While the acting director's words were reassuring, Alicia knew that it wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about the actions that followed. The public would be watching closely to see if the FBI would truly hold Stevens accountable, or if the department would turn a blind eye, as had happened in so many previous cases. Behind the scenes, the pressure was building. The internal affairs investigation into Officer Stevens was already underway, but Alicia knew that the real test would come when the findings were made public. If the officer wasn't held accountable, the public outrage would only grow louder. People were already demanding justice, not just for Alicia, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. The case had become a symbol of a larger fight, one that Alicia had been fighting in different ways for years. As the story gained traction, social media exploded. Hashtags like #Justice for Alicia and #Police Accountability trended across multiple platforms. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, with some applauding Alicia's bravery and others questioning the fairness of the situation. Videos of similar incidents, of police brutality and misconduct, began to surface. Citizens who had experienced racial profiling took to Twitter, recounting their own stories. The hashtag became a rallying cry for those who felt their voices had been ignored for far too long. One particular tweet went viral: "This could be anyone, but today it's Alicia Matthews. How many more people have to be silenced before we finally get the justice we deserve?" The tweet struck a chord with thousands of people who had experienced the same fear, the same frustration, and the same hopelessness. Alicia's name became a symbol of resistance, of hope, and of change. But as Alicia watched the waves of social media posts and news stories unfold, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This wasn't about her. It was never about her. It was about everyone who had been mistreated, misjudged, or overlooked. She knew that this was the moment to act, to make a difference. She couldn't back down now, not after all the progress that had been made. Meanwhile, Officer Stevens was struggling to cope with the fallout. He had been placed on administrative leave, and his actions were now under intense scrutiny. His colleagues in the police department tried to defend him, but the public was unforgiving. Many people demanded that he be fired immediately, and calls for his arrest began to grow louder. Stevens, who had once walked through the department with a sense of authority and entitlement, now found himself on the defensive. The weight of the accusations against him was heavy, and his future was uncertain. Stevens wasn't used to being questioned. He had spent years in law enforcement, rising through the ranks, and always believing that his actions were justified. But now, as the story spread, he found himself second-guessing everything he had done, everything he had believed in. He tried to lay low, hoping that the media storm would blow over. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be like the others. This time, things were different. The public reaction was intense, but it was also a reflection of something much deeper. People were tired of the injustice. They were tired of the system protecting those who abused their power. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. Alicia knew that this was just the beginning. The storm was far from over, and the pressure would only continue to mount. But she was prepared. This was her fight, and she was ready to see it through, no matter how difficult it became. Alt. No, it was the realization that she had been targeted simply because of who she was, because of her race, her gender, and the assumptions that came with both. She tried to calm herself, but it was difficult. It wasn't every day that you found yourself facing a police officer who had crossed so many lines. Yet, deep down, she knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger issue that plagued the country, something that was all too common for people like her. Despite the emotional toll, Alicia knew she had to handle this with care. She couldn't just walk away and forget what had happened. The officer had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. But before anything else, she needed to report it. She took a deep breath and dialed the number for the FBI's Internal Affairs Office, the familiar voice on the other end barely able to contain her shock when Alicia introduced herself. "Director Matthews," the voice asked, a little too stunned for professionalism. "Is everything okay?" Alicia hesitated for just a moment, weighing her words. She didn't want to sound like she was exaggerating, but she knew the gravity of the situation. "No, it's not," Alicia finally said. "I was just assaulted by a police officer during a traffic stop. I need you to start an investigation immediately." There was a brief pause before the voice replied, "Of course, Director. We'll take it from here." "You're safe, right?" Alicia nodded, even though the person on the other end couldn't see her. "I'm fine. Just shaken up. But I want this handled swiftly. I need this officer's history, and I want to know everything about him." Alicia hung up the phone and sat for a few moments in the silence of her car. She felt her heart racing, but there was no turning back now. She had taken the first step in making sure that the officer would be held accountable for his actions. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how much this moment represented. It wasn't just an isolated incident with one bad cop. It was part of a much larger issue. She had seen it in the cases she had handled at the FBI, in the stories of police brutality that had swept through the news, and in the everyday lives of people who had to navigate a system that often treated them as if their lives didn't matter. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and meetings. The FBI's Internal Affairs Office immediately launched an investigation into the officer's behavior. Alicia made sure that everything was documented, every detail, every piece of evidence, every moment of the interaction. The officer's name was quickly revealed, Officer Mark Stevens. He had been with the police department for nearly a decade, and his file was soon pulled. It didn't take long to find that Officer Stevens had a history of complaints against him, complaints that had been ignored, dismissed, or swept under the rug. The more Alicia dug, the more disturbing the information became. Stevens had been accused of aggressive behavior toward civilians, especially people of color. In several instances, he had been caught on body cameras making racial remarks or using excessive force. But despite the complaints, the department had done little to address the issue. It was all too familiar. Another case of a law enforcement officer with a history of misconduct who had been allowed to operate with impunity. Alicia wasn't surprised, though. She had seen this before, and she knew how hard it was to hold law enforcement accountable. It wasn't just a problem with one officer or one department, it was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed at every level. Still, the idea that she had been on the receiving end of Stevens' behavior was something Alicia couldn't shake. It felt like a betrayal. She had spent her career fighting for justice, for fairness, for equality. Yet, here she was victimized by the very system she had dedicated her life to protecting. Later that evening, Alicia sat in her office, staring at the file on her desk. She could feel the exhaustion creeping in, but there was no time for rest. She needed to see this through. She needed to make sure that Stevens would face the consequences of his actions. And, more than that, she needed to send a message. A message to every officer who thought they could get away with abuse. A message to every person who had ever been a victim of police brutality. No one, not even a police officer, was above the law. As Alicia continued to go through the documents, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant. Director Matthews, I just got word that Officer Stevens has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The department is cooperating with us, but there's a lot of media attention. Should we prepare a statement? Alicia stared at the message for a moment before typing out her response. Yes, but we need to be careful with our wording. I want to make sure we're clear about the seriousness of the situation. We're not just dealing with a single incident, this is part of a larger problem. We need to hold everyone accountable. She sent the message and leaned back in her chair. It wasn't easy being the FBI director, especially when she had to face these kinds of issues. But it was moments like this that made her job so important. She wasn't just fighting for justice for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. It wasn't just a matter of one bad cop, it was about changing the system, making it better for everyone. Alicia knew it would be a long road, but she was prepared to walk it. Meanwhile, the officer remained unaware of the storm brewing around him. Stevens, still on administrative leave, was given a brief moment of reprieve. But Alicia knew it wouldn't last. The media was already picking up the story, and soon, the whole world would know what he had done. The story would break, and his actions would be exposed for what they were. In the days that followed, the pressure continued to build. The media didn't let up, and Alicia's name became synonymous with the story. While some people admired her for standing up against police misconduct, others criticized her for being too harsh. They called her biased, said she was using her position for personal gain. But Alicia didn't let it get to her. She had been through worse, and she knew what she stood for. It wasn't about personal feelings or politics, it was about making sure that justice was served, no matter who you were or what position you held. The investigation into Officer Stevens continued to unfold, with more and more details coming to light. The truth was starting to surface, and there was no turning back now. Alicia had made sure of that. He stared at her for a moment longer than usual, his expression hardening as if he had already made up his mind about her. I need you to step out of the vehicle, he ordered, his tone sharp. Alicia's eyebrow raised slightly in surprise. I'm sorry, officer, but is there a reason you need me to step out? She had dealt with her fair share of unreasonable officers, but this was unusual. The officer's jaw tightened. I said step out. Now. Alicia took a deep breath. She could feel the tension in the air now. She wasn't some scared civilian. She had faced worse situations, far more dangerous ones, in her career. But this felt different. She was aware that, in some places, her presence especially as a black woman was met with suspicion, even hostility. Still, she had a job to do, and she wasn't going to let this officer throw her off track. But she also knew when to stand her ground. And she wasn't about to be intimidated. Why are you doing this? Alicia asked calmly. Her voice was even, but the edge of authority in it couldn't be ignored. I have given you my documents. There is no reason for this. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, placing his hand on the door, pushing it open with unnecessary force. His face was inches from hers, his breath heavy. You think you're too good for this, don't you? I bet you think you can get away with anything. Alicia felt a cold chill sweep over her. She knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about power. The officer wasn't just pulling her over for a routine stop, he had already judged her, made assumptions based solely on her appearance. His hostility had nothing to do with her driving and everything to do with his own prejudices. I don't know what you're talking about, Alicia said, keeping her tone level and her composure intact. Please, step back from the vehicle. But the officer didn't move. Instead, his hand shot out, grabbing her arm roughly. The action was sudden, and Alicia, though taken aback, reacted quickly. She could feel the adrenaline kick in, her training coming into play. She had been in dangerous situations before, but this wasn't supposed to be one of them. Yet here she was, facing an officer who was clearly escalating the situation. "Let go of me," Alicia said firmly, her voice no longer calm. "I am asking you to step back. Now." But the officer didn't listen. Instead, his grip tightened. He pulled her out of the car and shoved her roughly against the side of the vehicle, his hand digging into her shoulder. Alicia was no stranger to physical confrontations, but this felt different. It was as if everything had become a blur, the officer's actions unpredictable, out of control. She could feel the humiliation, the anger rising inside her. But she knew she had to stay calm. She had to protect herself, and more importantly, she had to protect her identity. If this went wrong, there would be consequences. Not just for her, but for the people who relied on her every day. With every ounce of composure she had left, Alicia looked the officer in the eye. "You're making a huge mistake," she said slowly. Her voice didn't waver, even as her heart raced in her chest. "You don't know who I am." The officer sneered at her. "I don't care who you are. You're just another arrogant person who thinks they can get away with anything." That was when Alicia made a decision. She needed him to stop. To realize that he had crossed a line. "I'm the FBI director," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. For a moment, the officer froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. He took a step back, as if suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. But Alicia wasn't done. She wasn't about to let him off the hook for his actions. "I want your badge number. Now." The officer's hand shook as he reached for his badge, muttering something unintelligible under his breath. But Alicia wasn't listening anymore. She had done her job in the most difficult of circumstances, even though the officer had tried his best to push her buttons. He had underestimated her. And now, she would make sure he understood the consequences of his actions. Alicia didn't wait for the officer to say anything else. She turned and walked back to her car, her steps deliberate, leaving the officer standing there in stunned silence. The incident was far from over, but Alicia knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let this go.